What's up, my biker friends, and welcome back to another video. It is time to review my 2022 1290 Super Adventure R from KTM. Now, if you found this video, there's a very good chance that you are familiar with the specs of the bike, so I'm not going to talk about the specs and sort of read down the spec sheet. I'm going to talk about how it is to live with the bike and how my experiences were with riding this bike off and on road. And the issues that I have with the bike, because in the first time after owning 3 KTMs, I had a major issue with this particular bike. So I'll go into that in this video and the reasons why I sort of picked the 2022 model over the predecessor. So let's get started. So let's give you a little bit of background to my experience that I've had so far with KTM. This is my third 1290 Super Adventure bike from KTM. I owned a 2018 1290 Super Adventure S model. That was my first KTM bike after I owned a BMW GS for 2 years. I put 48,000 kilometers on the bike and had a great time with that motorcycle and had zero problems with it. I did a review on that. If you're interested in it, I'll put it in the description. After that, I bought a 2022 R model because I was starting to get into off-road riding, and I was interested in getting into the R model because it is tuned more for off-road riding. It has the larger wheels, and it also has a different suspension system, which is a non-semi-active suspension. This is a fully manually higher spec suspension system. These are the two key items that differentiate the R model from the S model, so I was keen on riding that. I put 30,000 kilometers on that bike before I purchased this 2022 model of the 1290 Super Adventure R. So why I decided to sort of upgrade to the 2022 model. Now, of course, this model, even though KTM claimed they had changed 80 or 90% of the parts, is still very much a 1290 Super Adventure. It still has all the great things that made the predecessor great. Lots of power, lots of torque, sort of the top of the range electronic assistance in there. It's very comfortable to ride long distance, and it's off-road capable as an adventure touring bike. All these things were there, but there are three things that really stood out for me on the current model, and I'll go into those in detail. Now, the first thing has something to do with the design changes that they've made in the sort of 2021 models and up the current model, and that's the tank design. It's the most obvious thing when you look at both bikes side to side, that they've changed the tank design. Now, they've used the split tank design that they introduced in the more recent 790, 890 sort of mid-range adventure bike series. And the benefit of having that split tank design is that the bike carries the fuel much lower, which helps with the center of gravity of the bike. And it was very apparent when I first got to ride it. I was one of the first ones to ride it in 2021 when the bike came out in the Enduro Action Team Park. It was the first time that I had a chance to see what all those design changes actually felt like when riding the bike off-road. I actually did a video on that as well. Link it in the description if you're interested in sort of my first thoughts of the bike. So that split tank design helps to reduce the center of gravity. If you ever have ridden a 1200 or 1250 BMW GS, you know what it feels like when you have a very low center of gravity. Now, for the BMW, it's the inline boxer engine that sits very low in the frame that allows you to have sort of a very good balance at low speeds, especially helpful when you ride the bike off-road. Now, of course, this KTM doesn't get anywhere near sort of the handling of a GS, but for a KTM 1290, it's a huge improvement, which is apparent right away when you start to ride it at low speed. There's another advantage from that design change, and that is that the tank now sort of sticks out a little bit at the bottom, which helps when you drop the bike doesn't sort of lay flat on the ground as the predecessor did. The predecessor was a very sort of slim design, relatively top heavy. It looked great. Whenever you put the bike on the side, there were instances where it was really difficult to lift the bike up. I had a few incidences in the Enduro Action team when I dropped the bike on sand and it's hard to get grip and lift the bike up because it's so flat and so top heavy. Add sort of deep sand to it, it was almost impossible for me to pick up the bike. That was one of the sort of key improvements that I really started to appreciate on this motorcycle. Also on the trips that we did. Usually I'm not by myself when I'm riding off-road, but just knowing that if I am by myself, that it would be much easier to lift up the bike. And in sort of my first test ride with the bike in the Enduro Action team, I dropped it I think 3 times and had no issues of picking the bike up. So that's a huge benefit of sort of the design changes that they've made in the current model. The second thing I want to talk about is probably one of the most underrated features. If I view other reviews on the bike, that's usually just touched on, but that's the suspension system. I think it's an amazing improvement that they've made, again, from the predecessor to this model, which I didn't actually notice when I was riding it for the very first time in the Enduro Action team. I only had the comparison to my S model at the time, and it felt better, it felt more plush because it has more suspension travel, but I didn't actually see the difference to the predecessor. Only after owning the R model for a year and a half and now having this bike and ridden it in sort of similar situations, did I really start to appreciate how good the suspension really is and how much they've improved it. So how does it feel when you ride the bike? What's the actual difference? Now, on the predecessor, on the R model, I had issues with the bike bottoming out. Not so much the rear shock, but the sort of front fork. Even in relatively moderate sort of off-road terrain, stuff that is, you know, around where I live, it's just sort of forest tracks, nothing too special. But I would have incidences where the fork would bottom out and I wouldn't even be going that fast. Nice hit. So in order to compensate for that, I would set the bike in its sport setting. Now the bike basically has sort of 3 standard settings. I mean, there's everything in between, but there's sort of the comfort setting, which is sort of very plush setting. There's a standard setting somewhere in the middle, and a sport setting where you have a relatively stiff suspension, and anywhere in between, because it's a manually adjustable suspension. You can set it to anything in between. But what I did do is actually set it to the sport setting, which gave me a relatively stiff suspension, and then I increased the preload on the fork in order to sort of help the fork from not bottoming out. That meant I was riding with relatively stiff suspension on the road. That's great, actually. It's kind of the sport setting and it feels nice. And it was fine off-road too. It was certainly much better than the S model that I had before, where the suspension didn't really cope with sort of extended rides off-road, especially when you start to pick up the speed. So it was definitely an improvement, but compared to this model, to the 2022 model, I can now have the suspension settings in the standard mode, which means it's a much softer setting in standard mode. So it takes sort of the superficial bumps away and just kind of flattens it out really easily. But then when the terrain gets rougher and you have bigger bumps, you have rocks in there, there's a lot of sort of progression in a suspension that prevents the bike from fully bottoming out. So you can ride it really rough, you can even jump the bike, and you have to jump it pretty high in order to get the suspension system to bottom out, which I have done in the Enduro Action team. I've been able to jump it high enough that it would almost bottom out. But normally when you ride it for some kind of adventure touring, I've never had the issue of the suspension bottoming out. So even if I ride it on normal roads, this is a perfect setting, a perfectly comfortable setting. And when the terrain gets rougher, I know that my suspension system will work really well and keep the wheels planted. I mean, that's the whole point of the suspension system, that is actually quick enough to sort of cope with the change in terrain, to keep your bikes planted on the ground and give you that control that you need when you ride your bike off-road. Now, the third thing that I really appreciate on this bike is actually an electronic feature that they put in, and that is the rally mode. That is an extra that you have to buy, and it was absolutely worth it for me. The rally mode allows you to sort of set your throttle response and your traction settings in the rally mode, and especially the traction control can be adjusted on the fly. There's a setting from 1 to 9 where you can set the traction control on the left hand side with the plus and minus button here. So it allows you to change traction control as you ride, so you don't have to go into the sub menus and change that. And that's been quite beneficial in some of the rides that we've done. If I need a bit more traction, if it gets sandy, I usually dial it down a bit to 1, 2, or 3 setting, and for normal riding it's between 4 and 5. And let's say if you ride in the rain and you want a bit more sort of intervention, you can dial it up to 9, which is really cool. Also, it saves the settings. My predecessor bike didn't by default save the settings of the traction control or the ABS setting for that matter. I had to buy a little dongle for 100 euros and sort of plug it into the bike so it would remember the settings when you turn off the bike. You stall the bike, also when you turn off the bike. So you find yourself turning the bike on or shuts off because you dropped the bike, you know that the settings are exactly the same with this current model if you have the rally mode installed. Now there's a few sort of minor things that sort of improved with the bike that is actually something that I appreciated over time. It's the larger display. It is quite nice. It's a lot easier to read off the information. They've definitely improved that. But the only caveat is that you cannot display as many information fields as you could on the predecessor. So I've got the tire pressure in the front and rear, the temperature, and the odometer that's displaying sort of in the lower bowl. On the predecessor, I had, I think, up to 10 different fields in there, including the voltage of the battery, the engine temperature, the sort of daily trip kilometers, things like that. You could just pick and choose. So it's a bit unfortunate that even though we have more real estate on the display, there's actually less information that they show you at any given time. Overall, it's not a big issue, but it's nice to have. Also, the keyless system that I've used on the bike, they've improved a little bit. It was always possible to pop the tank cap off without using a key, but if you wanted to get to your seat and wanted to pop the seat off, you always needed a key on the predecessor. Now here, you don't ever need to take your key out. I always have it in my pocket, and all the things you can just do with buttons now. So also the seat, there's a little button, if you have the ignition on, that the seat pops up. It's just a little creature comfort, not a big deal, but you know, a sort of an incremental improvement to the predecessor. So let's talk about the issue that I had with this motorcycle. Now, I did an entire video on what happened, so if you're interested in the full detail, I will also have that link in the description to sort of give you sort of the long version of the story. The short of it is, at about 16,000 kilometers that I had ridden with the motorcycle, so I had already done sort of a major trip to Greece and Albania, and I made a trip to the Nordkap through Finland and Norway, so I had 2 major trips under my belt. And then for my last trip of the season of last year, I was going down to Munich, and at 190 kilometers an hour, the engine completely disintegrated at that high speed. So obviously that was a pretty scary moment, because if the engine starts to just break, and I could feel the rumbling in the bike. It's lucky I was quick enough to pull in the clutch so that the rear wheel wouldn't lock up at that speed. And you know, I would potentially crash in the middle of one of the busiest autobahns that we have here in Germany. So anyway, the engine, for whatever reason, I still don't know the exact reason what caused the engine damage, but it was pretty massive damage that I had fixed through the warranty service from KTM. KTM actually gave me a new engine, a replacement engine, or gave it to the dealership that installed it, and they took back the old engine. Unfortunately, the dealership didn't open the engine up to actually see what the cause of that was. I think that's the only people that know that is now the people in the factory. I'm sure they opened up the engine to see what the problem was. But they fixed the issue. It took a good 3 months for that problem to be fixed. Luckily, it was at the end of the season. And luckily, I had a very good friend of mine that gave me a replacement bike, also a 2022 1290 Super Adventure R, to continue my trip. That was the Trans-Italia Marathon. There's a video on that as well here on the channel. And the Alps tour from the Central Alps that I did with Stefan, who sort of gave me the bike, not just for the 2 trips, but also for the entire 4 weeks, sort of the last 4 weeks of the season, so I could sort of finish my riding in the season. So luckily I had that, and the impact of my riding wasn't as severe as it could have been. The whole thing took 3 months. I have about 1,000 kilometers on the new engine now. We're still in the middle of May at the moment, and I'm still braking in the engine and taking it a bit easy and getting it to the service very soon. I also, in the meantime, had the chance to talk to a few professionals through Stefan's contact. We were actually in contact with a company that do the engine repairs when KTM has engine problems during warranty time. There's a specialist that sits in Bavaria, and he says he gets about maybe 30% of the engines that are coming in warranty times. And we're able to visit his place and ask him a few questions, and I asked him how likely that is for a 1290 engine to sort of experience that kind of damage, and he said it's actually quite rare. From his experience, he doesn't see a whole lot of 1290 engines. I think in general the LCA engine from KTM, it's been sort of a refined design over many years, is considered a relatively reliable engine. So it really sucks that this happens to me, but just like any of the sort of positive and good experiences that I've had and shared on this channel, these are just my individual experiences. It's hard to extrapolate that over a large number of motorcycles. So I still hope this is a rare issue and that I hopefully will be sort of trouble-free for the time being. But it's worth mentioning that after almost riding 100,000 kilometers over 3 motorcycles, the 1290 series, that this has been my first sort of issue, and it was a major one as that. Let's talk about motorcycle weight for a little bit, because obviously these are the top of the line big bore adventure bikes, this bike and the Multistrada or the GS models. And it's quite interesting when you look at the weight. It still matters how heavy the bikes are. Now, I think this bike is listed in the range of somewhere 240 kilograms wet, which makes this one of the lightest motorcycle in that range. Now, with the latest iteration of the BMW, the 1300 GS, they claim a weight that's even lighter than this. And it's quite interesting because there is this Swiss channel. If I find the link again, I'll also put that in the description. It's quite interesting. It's a Swiss review channel, and they reviewed the S model of this motorcycle, the S model of the 1290 Super Adventure, against the Multistrada, against the 1300 GS. It's an overall good video. It's in German, unfortunately, so if you don't speak German, maybe I'll have subtitles in there. So it's an interesting video to have a sort of a comparison. But what I found really interesting, they actually took the time to put all these bikes on a scale. And it's quite interesting that despite the fact that the 1300 GS claims sort of a starting weight, whatever they call it, of 237 kilograms, the weight of the bike that they had for testing was 267 kilograms. So it was 30 kilograms heavier than the listed wet weight that BMW had put in. The second heaviest was the Multistrada V4S. It came in at 257 kilograms, and then the S model of the KTM 1290 Super Adventure came in at 247 kilograms. Now, they fueled the bikes up all the way to the top. I think sometimes they only, if they do the official measurements, they don't fill up the tank all the way. So they just fuel them up all the way like you would normally do as a normal rider, and equipped with the normal accessories that these bikes have when you buy them, decently equipped. So it's quite a bit of sort of change here. 10 kilograms is significant on these larger adventure bikes, so this still makes this one, the 1290 Super Adventure, one of the lightest of the heavy bikes, of the big bore adventure bikes. So this might be quite interesting information because it's sometimes hard to get by so the actual weight of these motorcycles. Now, if you ride them, there's a good chance you may not actually feel the direct difference, especially with the GS and the low center of gravity. The BMW will carry the weight better, as it always has. It's just interesting because they were pushing, especially BMW, were pushing sort of the weight target that they were trying to achieve quite strong in the initial marketing, and somehow they put out the good bike, but they kind of missed the weight target that they had set for themselves, I guess. In conclusion, I'm very happy with my third 1290 Super Adventure KTM. I had some great time with it in Greece and Albania. It was an amazing trip. I also took it all the way to the Nord Cup and through parts of the Finnish Trans-Euro Trail, and then the entire coast of Norway. And then the rest of the season there was a different bike that I could ride for the Trans-Italia Marathon, and then a road trip through the Central Alps. And it's performed really, really well. I'm really looking forward to this year's season with the bike. I'm not quite sure yet what I'll do in trips. That's still sort of in the making, but I'm very, very happy to have it back. And I hope this helps you a little bit in your own decision making. As I usually say though, don't buy a bike based on reviews or articles that you read. If you have the chance, ride the bike, and don't just ride it for an hour. Take it out for a day, ideally in conditions that you like to ride it in. So if this is the R model and you would like to do off-road stuff, maybe you find a place that lets you ride at least simple sort of off-road tracks, so they can get a feel for it if this is the right bike for you. For me, considering all the other bikes I've had the chance to ride, this is still a very good fit to the type of riding I do. I still do a lot of sort of road riding with the occasional off-road trip, which I really enjoy doing. So it's a very good fit also for sort of the long distances that I'm riding to get to the places that I ride. Anyway, if you have questions or comments, put them in the comment section. I usually answer my comments from you guys. And until then, ride safe, stay awesome.